The sun has been frozen at 5:42 for an eternity. I am lying on a table covered in what feels like cold skin, surrounded by the scent of honey and raw copper. Around me, tall, faceless things with obsidian eyes are sharpening long, thin blades, their laughter sounding like the dry rustle of insect wings. I only stepped into the circle for a photo. Now, I am being seasoned for a feast that never ends. Do you still think that perfect world is a dream? Rhythmic snap of brittle twigs beneath Alina's heavy leather boots echoed with an unnatural clarity through the stagnant air of the autumn woods. It was the 24th of September, a day where the transition of seasons felt heavy, almost suffocating, under the canopy of ancient oaks and suffocating pines. The forest exhaled a complex bouquet of damp decay, the metallic tang of wet soil, and a faint, sour undertone that prickled the back of her throat like wood vinegar. Sunlight fought its way down in jagged, dusty pillars, illuminating swarms of gnats dancing in the stagnant light, but the warmth never seemed to reach the mossy floor. She pushed through a dense thicket of brambles, the thorns catching on her canvas jacket with a dry, rasping sound like fingernails dragging across a chalkboard. Every movement felt sluggish, as if the air itself had gained a newfound viscosity, resisting her progress through the undergrowth. The shadows between the trees stretched out in elongated, skeletal fingers, shifting only when she moved, yet always feeling one step ahead of her vision. A single crow called out from somewhere deep in the brush, its voice harsh and jagged, before the sound was abruptly severed as if a heavy velvet curtain had been drawn across the entire horizon. The sudden absence of sound was violent in its intensity. The wind, which had been a low, morning hum in the upper branches, vanished entirely, leaving the woods in a state of impossible, crystalline stillness. Alina stopped mid-stride, her breath hitching in her chest as the internal roar of her own pulse became the only thing she could hear, a dull thudding in her temples. The silence was thick and physical, pressing against her eardrums with the weight of deep, cold water. It was not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping forest, but the expectant, predatory hush that precedes a killing strike. In the center of a small, perfectly circular clearing lay a ring of mushrooms, their stalks so pale and smooth they seemed carved from sun-bleached bone. They stood in a formation of terrifying geometric precision, forming a wall that felt more architectural than organic, as if they were a miniature fortress. Each cap was semi-translucent, catching the stray light and glowing with a faint, sickly opalescence that contrasted sharply with the surrounding gray dirt. The moss at the base of the ring was a vibrant, lush carpet, strangely untouched by the brown rot and brittle needles that claimed the rest of the forest floor. Within the confines of the fungal circle, the grass shifted in hue to an impossible, electric emerald that seemed to vibrate against the retina. It looked soft and yielding, like the pile of a royal tapestry, beckoning her to step away from the tangled, messy reality of the world outside its border. There was no debris inside that space, no fallen leaves, no broken sticks, just a pristine patch of green that defied the calendar of the dying year. The air directly above the circle shimmered with a subtle, oily heat haze, though the temperature in the forest remained biting and cold enough to turn her breath into mist. Alina reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth glass of her smartphone with a slight, involuntary tremor. The anticipation of capturing such a perfect, eerie anomaly sent a tingle through her nerve endings, a jolt of modern vanity overriding the ancient warnings whispering in her blood. She raised the device, the screen glowing bright and artificial against the muted tones of the woods, framing the ring in a sharp digital rectangle. The camera lens struggled to focus, the tiny autofocus motor clicking frantically as it tried to resolve the shimmering edges of the emerald grass. She took a single step forward, her boot crossing the threshold of the pale mushrooms, and the world seemed to buckle for a fraction of a second. A sound erupted from deep beneath the earth, a sharp, metallic twang like a silver wire snapping under immense tension. It was not heard so much as felt in her marrow, a vibration that rattled her teeth and made the fluid in her inner ear surge. For a fleeting moment, the horizon seemed to tilt at a 45-degree angle, and the colors of the forest bled into a blinding, white smear before snapping back into a state of heightened clarity. A sudden, painful pressure built behind her eyes, the kind of sensation that comes with a rapid descent in a pressurized aircraft cabin. She swallowed hard, her ears popping with a wet, squelching sound that echoed inside her skull, leaving her momentarily disoriented and lightheaded. The air suddenly felt lighter, thinner, and it began to taste of ozone and wild honey, a sweetness so intense it was almost nauseating. She shook her head to clear the sudden fog, the weight of the previous silence replaced by a strange, high-pitched hum that seemed to originate from the very air molecules around her. Compelled by a sudden surge of adrenaline, she began to move around the center of the circle, her thumb tapping the digital shutter in a rhythmic staccato. On the screen, the images appeared more vivid than reality itself, the greens and whites popping with a depth that felt three-dimensional and terrifyingly alive. She smiled at her reflection in the glass, noticing how the light seemed to dance in her pupils with a new, predatory brilliance she had never seen before. The fear that had gripped her moments ago was gone, replaced by an intoxicating sense of belonging and a strange, hollow euphoria that warmed her skin from the inside out. As she stepped back over the line of bone-white mushrooms, the physical resistance she had felt earlier was entirely gone, her body moving with a fluid, effortless grace. She turned to look back at the clearing one last time, tucking the phone into her pocket with a satisfied, lingering sigh. The woods remained as they were, yet something fundamental had shifted in the tapestry of the world she knew. She did not notice that the shadows were now pointing toward the sun, nor did she hear the total, absolute lack of birdsong that now stretched for miles in every direction, leaving her alone in the golden, breathless light. The return journey through the woods felt like floating through a gallery of impossible treasures. The bark of the birch trees no longer looked like peeling, weathered paper but like thin sheets of beaten silver, shimmering with an internal luminescence that defied the deep shadows of the undergrowth. Each leaf was an individual emerald, polished and translucent, vibrating with a vitality that made the previous memory of autumn decay feel like a distant, dusty hallucination. Alina's boots did not crunch on the ground so much as they seemed to bounce off a surface of soft, resilient velvet, and the weight of her own body felt light, almost buoyant. The air she drew into her lungs was no longer cold or damp, it was thick with the intoxicating, heady perfume of blooming jasmine, a scent so misplaced for the late days of September that it should have been a warning, yet it acted as a soothing, sweet balm to her senses. Her small, rusted vehicle stood at the edge of the dirt road, but even its chipped paint and dented fenders seemed to have been restored to a factory-fresh luster under the unwavering, brilliant sun. As she settled into the driver's seat, the worn fabric of the upholstery felt like the finest, most expensive cashmere against her thighs, and the mechanical rumble of the engine starting was no longer a rattle, but a melodic, rhythmic purr. The drive back to the town, which usually felt like an arduous, bumpy trek through winding and potholed lanes, was over in what felt like a mere handful of heartbeats. The road appeared smoother than she remembered, the curves more graceful, and the asphalt hummed beneath her tires with a sound like a low, harmonious choral chant that resonated in the very marrow of her bones. At the edge of the residential district, she pulled into a gas station that usually smelled of stale oil and cheap cigarettes, but now it was bathed in the refreshing scent of fresh rain and wild honey. An old man stood by the pumps, his skin a complex map of deep, golden wrinkles that seemed to catch the light like a finely sculpted bronze statue in a museum. When he looked at her, his eyes were a piercing, benevolent blue, and his smile was so profound and wide that it reached every corner of his face, radiating a warmth that felt like a physical, comforting embrace. He raised a hand in a slow, graceful gesture of greeting, and though no words passed between them, the sound of his rhythmic breath and the soft movement of his coat sleeves were as rich and resonant as the deep, low notes of an ancient cello. Everywhere she looked as she drifted through the streets, the mundane world had been replaced by a masterwork of light and perfect harmony. People walked along the sidewalks with a rhythmic, floating gait, their faces turned toward the sun with expressions of blissful, unyielding serenity that bordered on the divine. The colors of their clothes, once muted reds, dull blues, and faded yellows, were now vibrant silks and satins that shimmered and shifted with every slight movement. Even the stray cats basking on the brick walls looked like creatures of myth, their fur glowing with a soft, ethereal halo that blurred their edges against the sharp architecture of the buildings. A sense of profound, heavy safety settled over her, a warm blanket that effectively smothered the last flickers of her rational, whispering doubt. Her apartment door swung open on hinges that had squeaked and groaned for 3 long years, yet now they moved in absolute, lubricated silence, as if the wood and metal had forgotten how to friction. The air inside her living room was stagnant but remarkably sweet, filled with millions of dust motes that didn't just drift, but swirled in complex, purposeful patterns like tiny, floating grains of gold leaf. The afternoon light spilled through the large windows in thick, solid bars of amber, illuminating the mundane clutter of her life until every book and coffee mug looked like a sacred, cherished relic. She ran her hand over the wooden surface of her dining table, feeling the intricate grain of the oak as if it were a living, breathing thing, its texture vibrating against her palm with a subtle, electric hum. Hunger stirred within her, a gentle but insistent pull that drew her toward the small kitchen, where the simplest ingredients seemed to promise a feast beyond imagination. She cut a single, thick slice from a loaf of sourdough, the knife sliding through the crust with a crisp, musical crackle that sounded like the breaking of thin, perfect ice on a winter pond. When she spread the butter, the sound of the knife was a soft, silken rasp, and the yellow cream melted into the warm bread with a seductive, bubbling hiss that delighted her ears. The first bite was a violent explosion of flavor that defied any earthly description. It was the essence of the grain, the salt of the earth, and the concentrated sweetness of the sun all distilled into one perfect, yielding mouthful. Each slow chew was a sensory revelation, the texture of the bread feeling as delicate and intricate as the finest handmade lace against her tongue and palate. She eventually retreated to the sofa, sinking deep into the cushions that seemed to mold themselves perfectly to the unique contours of her body, erasing every ache and tension she had ever known. The sun remained fixed in the sky, a glorious, unblinking eye that bathed her in a constant, unwavering radiance that never seemed to dim or shift. All the anxieties of the past 24 years, the crushing deadlines, the unpaid bills, the long and lonely nights, felt like thin, gray ghosts that had been incinerated by this new, brilliant reality. She watched the way the light caught the edge of a glass vase, creating a spectrum of impossible colors that danced across the ceiling in a silent, kaleidoscopic ballet. There was no shadow in the corners of the room, only a soft, pervasive glow that promised a future of eternal, sun-drenched peace, and for the first time in her life, she let herself simply disappear into the warmth. Alina sat deeply recessed into the velvet embrace of her armchair, the fabric feeling like a layer of warm, living skin against her back. The book in her lap was heavy, its pages thick and cream-colored, smelling of vanilla, aged dust, and the sharp, chemical tang of fresh ink that seemed to have been printed only moments ago. Sunlight poured over the open paper in a thick, golden wash that made the black letters stand out with a clarity so intense it felt like they were carved into the surface. She turned a page, the sound a crisp, dry rasp that lingered in the air far longer than it should have, a soft echo of friction that vibrated through the bones of her fingertips. The warmth of the room was a physical weight, a cloying, honeyed heat that felt like a sedative, pulling her deeper into a state of drowsy, unearned contentment that she no longer questioned. The first discordant note in her perfect world was not a sight, but a sound that failed to arrive in its usual, rhythmic sequence. The wall clock, a heavy oak piece that had belonged to her grandmother, usually possessed a comforting, uneven heartbeat, a skip and a hum that marked the passage of seconds with mechanical honesty. Now, the sound had flattened into a singular, monotonous pulse that lacked the organic variation of shifting gears or the soft friction of a swinging pendulum. It was a rhythmic, hollow thud, a sound that felt less like a measurement of time and more like the sound of a heavy, padded door closing far away in an empty house. She found herself waiting for the secondary click, the tiny metallic adjustment of the internal escapement, but it never came, leaving a void in the air that began to itch at the very back of her consciousness. She lowered the book, the paper feeling suddenly abrasive and cold against her skin, and turned her gaze toward the high shelf where the clock sat. The glass face was caught in a flare of orange light, a brilliant, static reflection that made the Roman numerals glow like burning embers against the white porcelain. The brass hands, intricately carved and heavy with the weight of decades, were locked in a rigid embrace, pointing with frozen, unwavering precision at the minute markers. 5:42. The second hand, a thin needle of blackened steel that had once swept around the dial with a steady, ticking confidence, did not twitch, did not vibrate, and did not struggle against its sudden imprisonment. It stood perfectly still, a painted detail on a canvas, suggesting that the very concept of a future had been removed from the room, leaving her trapped in a single, golden moment. A slow, creeping chill began to replace the honeyed warmth of the afternoon as she reached for her smartphone on the side table. The glass was unnaturally cold, a sharp, crystalline contrast to the heavy air, and as the screen flickered to life, the artificial blue light seemed to struggle and die against the dominant, golden radiance of the house. The numbers on the display were clear, stark, and terrifyingly identical to the ones on the wall, 5:42. She watched the screen for what felt like several minutes, her thumb hovering over the smooth, unresponsive surface, waiting for the digital transition of a single minute that refused to come. Nothing changed, the battery remained at 88%, the signal bars were full and motionless, and the time remained an immutable monument to a moment that had become a permanent, digital scar on the world. Her feet felt heavy, as if she were walking through shallow, viscous water, as she stood and moved toward the large bay window that looked out over the neighborhood street. Each step across the wooden floorboards produced a sound that was too clear, too resonant, the dry groan of the timber echoing in the corners of the ceiling like a whispered warning from a house that was no longer her own. She reached for the heavy velvet curtain, its texture now feeling oily and strange, like the fur of a dead animal, and pulled it back to reveal the world outside. The street was bathed in the same intense, unwavering orange light that had filled her room, a stagnant flood of color that seemed to have no specific source and no directional flow. The air was perfectly still, not a single leaf on the oak trees across the road shivering, and the dust motes in the air hung like tiny, golden insects trapped in a block of ancient amber. High above the pointed rooflines of the suburban houses, the sun sat like a bruised, unblinking eye, its edges sharp and defined against a sky of deep, unnatural violet. It was not the soft, shifting orb of a typical late September afternoon, but a solid, glowing coin of fire that had been hammered into the firmament by an unseen hand. It did not sink toward the horizon, it did not flicker behind the distant hills, and it did not cast the long, purple shadows that usually mark the transition of a dying day. The horizon was a blur of heat and saturated color, a painted backdrop where no birds crossed the disk of light and no clouds drifted toward the east. The light felt stationary, a permanent fixture of a world that had forgotten how to turn, pinning her in place with its relentless, silent observation from the heavens. She pressed her forehead against the glass of the window, the surface feeling neither hot nor cold, but strangely neutral, like touching a limb that had gone completely numb. Looking down at the asphalt below, she searched for the familiar, messy sights of the late afternoon, the commuters returning home, the flickering of headlights, the distant hum of the freeway. The street was a void of human activity, the cars parked along the curb appearing as polished, motionless shells of metal and glass, their surfaces reflecting the orange sun with a blinding, terrifying intensity. There was no barking of a neighbor's dog, no slamming of a car door, and no rustle of wine through the dry, ornamental hedges that lined the driveways. The silence was not empty, it was a physical substance, a heavy, cloying syrup that had filled the world to the brink, suffocating the very possibility of sound or change. Beneath the suffocating layer of silence, a new sound began to emerge, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly within the cavity of her chest. It was a constant, oscillating hum, reminiscent of the drone of a massive power transformer or the vibration of high-voltage lines during a violent summer storm. The sound was pervasive, coming from the walls, the floor, and the very air she drew into her lungs, a mechanical thrumming that suggested a hidden, titanic machinery working just beneath the surface of her reality. It was a dry, metallic noise that made the fine hairs on her neck stand up, a sound of unseen gears grinding in a place where no gears should exist. Her heart began to sync its beat to the vibration, a frantic, thudding rhythm that pushed the blood into her ears with a pulsing, wet sound that she could no longer ignore. Turning away from the window, she stumbled toward the dark hallway that led to the foyer, her vision blurring slightly as the intensity of the light seemed to increase without actually getting brighter. The air in the hallway was thick with the smell of jasmine and honey, a scent so sweet it felt like it was coating her tongue and throat in a layer of sugar. The mirror in the foyer was a tall, silver-backed antique that now seemed to pull the light toward it, glowing with a soft, internal fire that illuminated the darkness of the corridor. She stopped in front of it, her hands gripping the cold marble of the console table so hard her knuckles turned white, and stared at the woman reflected in the glass. The face that looked back at her was a masterpiece of terrifying perfection, a version of herself that seemed to have been scrubbed of every flaw and every sign of life. Her skin was as smooth as polished alabaster, her eyes were wide and filled with a luminous, crystalline light, and her hair flowed in soft, impossible waves that didn't move even when she tilted her head. There was a flush of deep, healthy pink in her cheeks that looked like it had been applied by a master painter, making her look more like a porcelain doll than a living, breathing human being. She reached out to touch her own reflection, but her fingers stopped just short of the glass as she realized that she could not feel the warmth of her own breath against her hand. She looked down at her feet, expecting to see the familiar, dark silhouette of her body stretching across the polished floorboards, but there was only a void where her shadow should have been. The floor beneath her was a uniform, brilliant plane of honey-colored wood, glowing as if the light were emanating from the grain of the timber itself rather than from the windows. There was no shadow cast by her legs, no darkness beneath her heels, and no silhouette of her body on the wallpaper behind her, despite the intense light filling the room. She moved her hand, waving it in front of the mirror and over the floor in a desperate, frantic motion, but the light remained undisturbed, flowing around her limbs as if she were made of clear glass. The lack of a shadow felt like a physical amputation, a missing piece of her soul that left her untethered to the physical world, floating in a sea of eternal, shadowless radiance. She looked at her feet again, seeing the way they rested on the wood, but without the shadow to anchor them. She felt as though she were levitating, a ghost caught in a golden cage. The hum in the walls grew louder, a thrumming roar that seemed to be celebrating her realization, a mechanical choir singing to a world where time had died. She was no longer a person standing in a hallway, she was a centerpiece in a display, a doll prepared for a feast that would never end, illuminated by a sun that would never set. Her breathing came in shallow, jagged gasps, the only sound in the house that felt real, yet even that was quickly swallowed by the rhythmic vibration of the floorboards. She tried to step back, but her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, moving with a fluid, graceful ease that mocked her internal panic. The smell of jasmine grew even stronger, now laced with the faint, metallic scent of a butcher's shop, a coppery undertone that cut through the sweetness like a knife. She was trapped in the center of a perfect, beautiful lie, a world where the light was a hunter and the silence was a net, and she was the only thing left that still knew how to be afraid. As she stared into her own shadowless eyes in the mirror, she realized that the rubies in her cheeks were not from the cold or from health, but were the marks of something being prepared. The room seemed to contract around her, the walls leaning in with a predatory curiosity, and the golden light felt like it was beginning to bake the very air out of her lungs. The sun outside remained fixed at 5:42, a silent witness to her slow-motion collapse into the nightmare. There was no night coming to hide her, no darkness to offer a reprieve, only the endless, blinding glory of the clearing she had never truly left. She reached out one last time to touch the wall, her fingers tracing the floral pattern of the wallpaper, but the paper felt like skin, warm, slightly damp, and vibrating with that same horrific, mechanical pulse. The house was breathing with her, its tempo matching her own frantic pulse until they were a single, unified entity. She closed her eyes, but the light was so intense it bled through her eyelids, a persistent, orange glare that turned the inside of her skull into a bright, hollow chamber. In that moment of forced blindness, the hum finally found its voice, a thousand tiny, whispering sounds that crawled over her skin like invisible insects, telling her that the guests were almost ready. The heavy oak door swung outward with a soundless, terrifying ease, as if the wood itself had lost all density and mass. Alina stumbled onto the porch, her lungs burning as she dragged in the thick, jasmine-scented air that now felt like a physical weight pressing against her ribs. Her heart was no longer a muscle but a frantic, trapped bird, its wings battering against the cage of her sternum with a rhythmic thudding that echoed in the hollows of her skull. Cold perspiration broke out across her forehead, yet the droplets did not trickle down her skin, they remained frozen in place, like tiny, crystalline beads of glass clinging to her flesh. She gripped the wrought iron railing, but the metal did not feel cold or solid, it felt warm and slightly yielding, like the surface of a sun-warmed fruit that had begun to ripen past the point of safety. The street before her was a masterpiece of impossible clarity, every pebble and every blade of grass rendered with a sharp, agonizing detail that made her eyes ache. The light did not seem to fall from the sky so much as it emanated from every surface simultaneously, erasing the very concept of depth and silhouette. She looked down at her feet as she stepped onto the concrete walkway, and the breath hitched in her throat until it became a jagged shard of ice. There was no dark shape trailing behind her, no distortion of light beneath her boots to anchor her to the earth. The sidewalk was a uniform, glowing ribbon of pale gray, as if she were walking across a lit stage in a theater where the house lights had been turned to a blinding, infinite maximum. At the edge of the next lawn stood a woman she had known for 7 years, a neighbor whose name now felt like a slippery, half-forgotten dream. The woman was dressed in a floral sundress of such vibrant, pulsing reds and yellows that the colors seemed to bleed into the surrounding air like ink in water. She was holding a green garden hose, the plastic glistening with a wet, serpentine luster that made it look more like a living creature than a household tool. The woman did not look up immediately, her movements slow and choreographed, swaying with a rhythmic grace that matched the low-frequency hum vibrating through the soles of Alina's feet. Every fold of the neighbor's dress was illuminated with a terrifying, shadowless perfection, making her appear like a cardboard cutout pasted against a backdrop of impossible beauty. As Alina approached, the woman turned her head with a slow, mechanical precision, her neck muscles shifting beneath her skin like submerged cables. Her face was a mask of extreme, unadulterated joy, a smile stretching across her features that felt too wide for the anatomy of a human jaw. It revealed rows of teeth that were not the off-white of bone, but the brilliant, translucent white of high-grade porcelain, each tooth polished to a mirror-like shine. Her eyes were wide, the pupils tiny pinpricks in a sea of luminous, glassy blue, and they remained fixed and unblinking even as the orange sun beat down upon them. There was no recognition in that gaze, only a deep, predatory contentment that suggested Alina was not a neighbor, but a long-awaited guest arriving at the peak of the festivities. Alina opened her mouth to scream, to ask for help, to demand to know why the sun refused to move, but her vocal cords felt as though they had been coated in thick, dry sand. She pushed the air from her lungs, but the only sound that emerged was a thin, papery rasp, a dry harumph that was instantly swallowed by the heavy silence of the neighborhood. Her throat felt constricted, the muscles refusing to cooperate, as if the very air she was trying to use had been turned into a solid, unyielding substance. She tried again, her face contorting with the effort, but her voice was a ghost, a hollow echo of a self that no longer existed in this realm of perfect, vibrant light. The woman's smile only grew wider in response, the corners of her mouth twitching upward toward her ears in a gesture that felt less like an emotion and more like a physical stretching of the skin. The sound of the water changed then, shifting from a gentle, splashing murmur into something deeply visceral and disturbing. As the stream hit the dark soil of the flower bed, it no longer sounded like liquid hitting earth, it began to sound like the wet, rhythmic tearing of heavy fabric or the sound of raw meat being pulled apart by steady hands. Shirip. Shirip. The sound was wet, fibrous, and agonizingly loud in the windless afternoon, a sound of destruction disguised as a mundane chore. Alina watched as the water hit a rose bush, and the leaves did not bend under the weight, they seemed to absorb the impact with a dull, fleshy thud that made her stomach churn with a sudden, acidic nausea. The neighbor continued to aim the hose with a steady hand, her unblinking eyes never leaving Alina's face as the sound of the tearing flesh intensified, filling the air with a rhythmic, sickening pulse. Terror, cold and absolute, finally broke the paralysis of her limbs, and Alina turned, her boots slapping against the pavement with a sound that felt muffled and distant. She began to run, her movements feeling sluggish and heavy, as if the atmosphere had been replaced by a dense, invisible syrup that resisted every forward motion. She headed toward the end of the street, toward the dark, tangled treeline of the forest where the mushroom ring waited to be found. Her breath came in ragged, burning gulps, and the smell of jasmine was suddenly replaced by a sharp, pungent odor of cloves and cinnamon, a spice-heavy scent that felt like it was intended to preserve something rather than to perfume it. The sidewalk beneath her seemed to stretch, the distance between the houses expanding with every step she took, as if the road were an accordion being pulled open by a giant, unseen hand. She looked to her left, then to her right, and realized with a jolt of pure, primal dread that the houses were no longer unique, they were identical copies of one another, repeating in a perfect, mathematical sequence. Every lawn had the same number of dandelions, every driveway held the same silver car reflecting the same unmoving sun, and every window was draped with the same heavy, velvet curtains. The symmetry was absolute and suffocating, a geometric prison that mocked her attempt to escape. The trees at the end of the road, once a messy and organic boundary of the woods, now appeared like a row of emerald spears, each one placed at an exact, measured distance from the next. There was no chaos here, no growth, only the rigid, terrifying order of a world that had been meticulously designed for a singular, horrific purpose. The wind began to rise, but it did not bring the cool relief of an autumn breeze, it was a hot, stagnant gust that carried the heavy, cloying scent of wild honey and ancient, sun-baked musk. It blew across her skin with a tactile, oily sensation, leaving a residue that felt like a thin film of grease. Alina felt the wind, she heard the low, whistling moan as it passed the corners of the houses, but when she looked at the trees and the ornamental hedges, not a single leaf moved. The foliage remained as rigid as if it had been cast in green glass, frozen in a state of eternal, windless perfection. The discrepancy between what she felt and what she saw created a violent vertigo in her mind, a sense that her senses were being systematically dismantled by the environment around her. As she ran, the scent of the air shifted again, losing its sweetness and taking on a heavy, animalistic undertone that smelled of hot fur, raw copper, and the salt of a predator's breath. It was a thick, oppressive smell that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath her, as if she were running across the back of a gargantuan, sleeping beast. The spice smell of cloves became an undertone to this new, muscular scent, creating a terrifying olfactory image of a carcass being prepared for a grand, ceremonial meal. Her skin began to crawl with the sensation of thousands of tiny, invisible insects scurrying over her limbs, a tactile hallucination brought on by the sheer, overwhelming weight of the atmosphere. She felt as though she were being seasoned, her fear acting as a bitter marinade for a palate she could not hope to understand. The forest edge remained agonizingly far away, a green wall that retreated as quickly as she approached it, trapping her in a perpetual, sun-drenched treadmill. The orange sun, still locked at the mark of 5:42, sat heavy and bloated in the sky, its light becoming more orange, more saturated, until the entire world looked as though it were being viewed through a veil of drying blood. Alina's legs began to ache, a deep, throbbing pain that felt like her bones were being slowly turned into lead, yet she could not stop. The humming in the ground had risen to a rhythmic, choral chant, a wordless vibration that seemed to be counting down the seconds of a time that no longer existed. She was a small, shadowless figure moving through a landscape of terrifying beauty, a speck of grit in a perfect, golden machine that was slowly, inevitably, beginning to close its jaws. Every detail of the world screamed its artificiality at her, the way the light did not flicker, the way the grass did not crunch, the way her own body felt like a foreign object she was merely piloting. The neighbor with the hose was gone now, replaced by the next identical neighbor on the next identical lawn, each one holding a green hose, each one smiling with too many teeth, each one producing the sound of tearing flesh as they watered the shadowless flowers. Alina felt a sob rise in her chest, a physical knot of despair that she could not release, as she realized the forest was not a sanctuary, but the very place where the trap had been set. The scent of honey and blood grew so strong it was almost a taste on her tongue, and as she looked ahead, she saw the first of the emerald trees begin to shimmer, its bark turning into the same bone-white texture of the mushrooms that had started it all. The forest behind the house had dissolved into a thick, luminous haze that was neither mist nor smoke, but a shimmering curtain of suspended gold particles. Alina stumbled back toward the porch, her boots feeling like heavy weights of lead as she retreated from the emerald wall that was no longer a forest, but a breathing, vibrating entity. The air was so saturated with the scent of wild honey and ancient cloves that every breath felt like swallowing a mouthful of warm, viscous syrup. She reached for the brass handle of the front door, expecting the resistance of a locked bolt, but the door yielded with a silent, terrifying grace, swinging inward as if the house itself were drawing a deep, predatory breath. The interior was flooded with that same unwavering, stagnant sunlight, making every grain of wood on the floorboards stand out in sharp, agonizing relief. Inside the kitchen, the air was even thicker, a claustrophobic fog of sweetness that clung to the back of her throat and made her stomach churn with a sudden, violent nausea. Several woven baskets now occupied the granite countertop, though she had no memory of placing them there or even owning them. They were overflowing with fruits that defied any earthly taxonomy, translucent spheres the color of bruised violets, elongated pods that pulsed with a soft, internal amber light, and clusters of berries that wept a thick, silver nectar. The nectar dripped slowly from the edge of the counter, hitting the hardwood floor with a rhythmic, heavy sound, tup, 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 that sounded more like the falling of thick blood than the splashing of juice. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the ceiling, their leaves not brittle but supple and oily, exuding a scent of damp earth and funeral lilies that fought for dominance against the overwhelming sugar. Beneath the cloying sweetness of the kitchen, a new sound began to vibrate through the soles of her feet, a rhythmic, abrasive grinding that originated from the dark mouth of the basement stairs. Shirk. 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 It was the sound of cold, tempered steel being dragged across a wet whetstone with methodical, agonizing patience. Each stroke was followed by a brief, expectant silence that felt heavier than the sound itself, a pause that allowed the metallic vibration to settle into the very marrow of her bones. The friction produced a high-pitched, singing note that seemed to pierce her eardrums, a sound of preparation and sharpening that suggested a singular, lethal intent. Alina gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white and bloodless, as the vibration of the sharpening stone synchronized with the frantic, irregular hammering of her heart. She backed away from the basement door, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, and fled toward the stairs leading to the second floor. Every step she took felt as though she were moving through deep water, her muscles screaming with a fatigue that was both physical and spiritual. The hallway seemed to stretch and narrow, the floral wallpaper appearing to ripple and shift as if the painted vines were slowly beginning to uncoil in the stagnant, golden light. She reached her bedroom and threw herself into the furthest corner, pressing her spine against the cold, unyielding plaster of the walls. Her eyes were fixed on the window, where the bloated, orange sun remained pinned to the sky at exactly 5:42, a silent, celestial witness to the slow-motion collapse of her reality. The silence of the house was suddenly interrupted by the first of the visitors, though no door had opened and no floorboard had groaned under the weight of a footfall. A figure stood in the doorway of the bedroom, a tall, spindly shape that seemed to be composed more of shadow and shifting mist than of flesh and bone. Its garments were long and tattered, woven from something that looked like iridescent spider silk and morning fog, swirling around its limbs even though the air in the room was perfectly, unnaturally still. The creature did not breathe, did not blink, and did not acknowledge her presence with any sign of emotion or malice. It simply occupied the space, a silent sentinel that exuded an aura of ancient, cold patience that made the fine hairs on Alina's arms stand straight up. More figures began to manifest in the room, emerging from the corners and the shadows with the same terrifying, liquid silence. They were all unnaturally thin, their limbs elongated and delicate like the legs of a harvestman spider, their height so great that their heads nearly brushed the ceiling. Their skin was the color of skimmed milk, smooth and featureless, lacking the ridges of ears or the protrusion of a nose, leaving only the broad, flat planes of their cheeks. In the center of their faces were eyes like vast, obsidian pools, reflecting the orange sunlight with a depthless, shimmering intensity that felt as though it were pulling her soul out through her pupils. Below the eyes, a thin, horizontal slit served as a mouth, currently sealed shut with a precision that made it look like a surgical scar. The guests did not surround her with the chaotic energy of a mob, they moved with the coordinated, clinical grace of a surgical team or a group of highly skilled artisans. They fanned out across the room, their long, pale fingers twitching with a rhythmic, anticipatory energy that made Alina's skin crawl. One of them drifted toward her vanity, its hand hovering over her jewelry box with a touch that was lighter than a breath, while another stood by the window, its head tilted at an impossible angle as it studied the unmoving sun. Their interest in her was not one of hatred or cruelty, but of a profound, professional curiosity, the way a master chef might inspect a rare and expensive cut of meat before the first incision is made. The leader of the group, a figure whose silk robes were dyed the color of a winter twilight, glided across the floor toward the corner where she sat huddled. Its movements were entirely frictionless, its feet never appearing to make contact with the floorboards, as if it were sliding across a surface of polished ice. As it came within an arm's length of her, Alina felt a wave of intense, dry cold emanate from its body, a chill that seemed to freeze the sweat on her brow into tiny, jagged crystals. It leaned forward, its smooth, earless head descending toward her face until she could see the swirling, kaleidoscopic patterns of gray and violet deep within its obsidian eyes. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, airless vacuum that seemed to amplify the sound of her own gasping, terrified breath. It was then that she heard the sound of their collective breathing, a sound that was not the intake of air through lungs, but a dry, rhythmic rustle that filled the chamber. It sounded like the rubbing together of thousands of dry insect wings, a papery, chitinous rasp that rose and fell in a sickening, hypnotic cadence. Shoo-hhhrrr. Shoo-hhhrrr. The sound was dry and dusty, smelling of old attics and sun-baked husks, a sound that belonged to creatures who had long ago forgotten the need for oxygen or blood. The vibration of the sound tickled the inside of her ear canals, a physical sensation that felt like tiny, invisible legs scuttling across her eardrums. The visitor reached out a long, tapering finger, the nail a sharp sliver of translucent pearl, and traced the line of Alina's jaw with agonizing slowness. The touch was not painful, but it was horrifyingly cold, leaving a trail of numb, tingling skin in its wake like the path of a slug. As the finger moved toward her throat, the creature's slit of a mouth began to stretch, revealing a dark, toothless interior that smelled of crushed mint and ancient, rotting roses. It did not speak, but a thought began to bloom in Alina's mind, a heavy, intrusive realization that was not her own. She was being measured, she was being appraised, and the sharpening sound from the basement was reaching its final, perfect crescendo. Outside, the orange light of the sun began to intensify, turning the room into a chamber of burning amber, while the scent of the strange fruits from the kitchen rose up the stairs in a suffocating, floral cloud. The other visitors began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that matched the sharpening of the knives, creating a harmonic resonance that made the glass in the windows chatter in their frames. Alina tried to pull away, to press herself deeper into the plaster of the wall, but her body refused to obey, her limbs becoming as rigid and decorative as the furniture around her. She was the centerpiece of the evening, the reason for the gathering, and the hunger she saw in those obsidian eyes was a hunger that had waited for centuries for a dish as sweet and terrified as she had become. The visitor with the silk robes withdrew its hand and made a sharp, clicking sound with its throat, a signal that the time for observation had ended. The other figures closed the circle, their mist-woven garments brushing against her skin with the sensation of cold, wet cobwebs. The smell of the basement, cold stone, wet metal, and raw copper, finally reached the bedroom, cutting through the jasmine and honey like a jagged blade. Alina watched as the figures began to lift her, their grip firm yet surprisingly delicate, as if they were afraid of bruising the skin before the feast. She was no longer a woman, no longer a person with a history or a name. She was merely a collection of textures and flavors, a seasonal delicacy to be served under the light of a sun that would never allow her the mercy of the night. Alina felt her consciousness beginning to drift, anchored only by the immense, leaden weight that had settled into her limbs. It was as if her blood had been replaced by liquid mercury, heavy and shimmering, pressing her down into the very fabric of the reality she was being forced to inhabit. She could not move a single finger, nor could she blink her eyes to clear the stinging, golden glare that had become a permanent part of her vision. When the thin, pale figures reached down to lift her, she felt no grip of fingers, only a collective, cold pressure that defied the laws of physics. They hoisted her frame with a terrifying, effortless grace, their spindly limbs moving in a synchronized, liquid motion that made her feel as light as a dried leaf, despite the crushing density that held her captive from within. As they carried her through the threshold of the bedroom, the familiar architecture of her home dissolved into a vast, impossible geometry. The narrow hallway did not end at the stairs but expanded outward into a gargantuan vaulted corridor that stretched toward a horizon of flickering torches and obsidian pillars. The ceiling was lost in a swirling vortex of violet clouds and golden sparks, echoing with a low, thrumming vibration that felt like the purr of a predatory god. Each step her captors took produced no sound on the floorboards, yet the air around them hummed with a frantic, static energy that made the fine hairs on her skin vibrate with a dull, persistent ache. She was a passenger in a nightmare of infinite proportions, moving deeper into the throat of a palace built from the wreckage of her own memories. They descended toward the dining area, but the modest room she once knew had been swallowed by a banquet hall of terrifying magnificence. The walls were draped in tapestries of living moss and woven moonlight, depicting scenes of hunts that lasted for centuries and feasts that never saw a dawn. Hundreds of the thin, faceless guests were already present, standing in rows along the perimeter of the hall like statues carved from frozen smoke. Their obsidian eyes all turned toward her in unison, a silent, tidal wave of observation that felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. The air here was colder, smelling of ozone, ancient parchment, and the sharp, coppery scent of 1,000 freshly whetted blades. In the center of the hall stood a table of such immense length that its far end disappeared into the amber haze of the distance. It was covered in a tablecloth of brilliant, bone-white fabric that did not look like linen or silk, but possessed the terrifying, supple texture of cured human skin. As they laid her down upon it, Alina felt the surface yield beneath her with a faint, wet squelch, the material feeling clammy and warm against her bare arms. It possessed a subtle, rhythmic pulse, as if the table itself were drawing breath from the very room, a living altar prepared for a singular, sacred purpose. She was positioned with surgical precision, her spine aligned with the central seam of the skin fabric, her head resting on a pillow of soft, white down that smelled of funeral incense and crushed lavender. The sounds within the hall began to swell, transforming from a heavy silence into a cacophony of refined, metallic violence. She heard the crystalline chime of thousands of glass flutes being raised in a silent toast, the sound sharp and brittle enough to draw blood from the ears. Beneath the chime was the persistent, rhythmic screech of silver forks and knives being dragged across porcelain plates, a sound of hunger that was both elegant and ravenous. And then came the laughter, a rising, vibrating roar of sound that possessed no warmth and no joy. It was a mechanical, choral hum that echoed from the flat planes of the guests' faces, a sound of pure, mathematical appreciation for the spectacle that was about to unfold. Slowly, the figures began to decorate her, their long, tapering fingers moving with the delicate care of florists. They placed garlands of deep, pulsating crimson lilies around her neck, the petals feeling like damp velvet against her throat, their scent so heavy it threatened to drown her. Bright, exotic fruits were nestled into the crooks of her elbows, their skins translucent and vibrating with a soft, internal light that matched the rhythm of her own failing pulse. Small, bitter herbs, rosemary, sage, and plants she had no name for, were tucked into the folds of her clothing, releasing a pungent, medicinal aroma that stung her nostrils. She was being garnished, prepared for the palate with a level of detail that suggested her terror was merely one of many spices intended to enhance the final experience. Outside the towering, arched windows of the hall, the sky underwent a violent, final transformation. The bloated sun, which had hung at 5:42 for an eternity, suddenly erupted into a brilliant, incandescent flare of movement. It did not set, but it bloated further, its golden light deepening into a thick, viscous crimson that saturated the atmosphere like a cloud of atomized blood. The light poured through the glass in heavy, red bars, staining the white tablecloth and the pale skin of the guests in a hue of deep, permanent gore. There were still no shadows, the red light was as pervasive as the orange had been, illuminating every pore of her skin and every petal of the lilies with a flat, inescapable clarity that denied the existence of darkness. A path opened through the sea of guests, and the high fairy began his approach toward the center of the table. He was taller than the others, his form draped in a heavy, flowing mantle constructed from thousands of individual, withered rose petals that had been stitched together with silver wire. His face was a smooth, alabaster mask of absolute serenity, his obsidian eyes reflecting the blood-red sun with a terrifying, hollow brilliance. In his right hand, he held a knife that was long, thin, and impossibly sharp, its blade forged from a metal that seemed to absorb the red light rather than reflect it. He moved with a heavy, regal dignity, the sound of his rose-petal cloak rustling like the dry, shifting sands of a desert. He stopped at her side, leaning over her until the scent of ancient roses and cold iron completely overwhelmed the smell of the lilies. He raised the knife, the tip of the blade pointing toward the red sky before he began the downward sweep. As the steel moved through the stagnant air, it produced a sound, a high, pure, and hauntingly beautiful whistle that resonated in the very center of Alina's brain. It was the sound of a perfect vacuum being filled, a note of such absolute harmony that it made her heart skip a beat in a final, frantic attempt to align itself with the music. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard, a sound that promised an end to the confusion and a beginning to the eternal, shadowless feast. In that final moment of clarity, the true nature of her prison was revealed to her with the coldness of a winter dawn. She realized that she would never die, for death required the passage of time, and time had been extinguished the moment she stepped into the circle of bone-white mushrooms. She would be carved, she would be tasted, and she would be consumed, yet she would remain whole and aware, a permanent fixture of this glorious, horrific celebration. Her horror was not a reaction to her fate, but the very essence of it, the seasoning that made her existence worthwhile to the creatures who now loomed over her with their toothless, smiling maws. The high fairy lowered the blade, and the first touch of the cold metal against her skin was not a pain, but a sensation of profound, icy belonging. The hall erupted in a final, deafening crescendo of laughter and the clinking of glass, a celebratory roar that shook the very foundations of the infinite palace. The red sun remained fixed in the sky, a permanent, bleeding eye that watched over a world where no shadow could ever hide the suffering of the guests or the glory of the meal. Alina closed her eyes, but the red light was still there, burning through her eyelids, reminding her that there was no night, no escape, and no end to the feast that had only just begun. She was the center of the world, a jewel of terror set in a crown of eternal light, surrounded by the rustle of insect-wing breath and the scent of honey and blood. The vibrations of the hall became her heartbeat, the laughter of the fae became her thoughts, and the weight of the mercury in her veins became the only anchor she had left. As the knife began its work, she felt a strange, hollow peace settle over her, the realization that she had finally found the perfection she had sought in the forest. It was a perfection of agony, a masterpiece of bright, unyielding despair that would endure as long as the sun remained at 542, which was to say, forever.